Hi, everybody. Today is Thursday, May 22nd, 2025, and our friend Graham Fuller is back with us. Welcome back, Graham.
Thank you. My pleasure, Nima.
Graham, when you look at the Trump administration and when we talk about them and when we consider the way that they're trying to somehow deal with the two conflicts in the Middle East and in Ukraine, to to me the face of this administration is Steve Witkoff and the way that he's trying to negotiate in the two fronts. And don't you think that Steve Witkoff, as time goes by, is weakening and somehow disappearing from the scene?
I wouldn't say that. I think it's a little too early to say. For one thing, it's quite fascinating to see that even though Marco Rubio is nominally the Secretary of State for Foreign Affairs in Washington, the difficult tasks of negotiation are being given to Witkoff, who has no official position whatsoever. But I was impressed when I heard an interview with Witkoff a couple of weeks ago, in that I felt that this, even though, yes, he's a real estate guy out of New York City, I don't like that culture. I would be suspicious of it. But he was talking about how to deal with people and that you have to begin to understand what other people want and where they're coming from. And I was impressed. I thought really understood the nature of negotiations with other people rather than simply dictating what it must be. I mean, he's far more skillful than Blinken, for example, who may be very well educated, but was a terrible diplomat. So, no, I don't think that Witkoff is weakening necessarily, but the dimensions of the problem are becoming clearer. There are no easy solutions, but I think he's probably on the right path, and I am glad that he is the one who's negotiating in these areas. And as you know, I mean, it's a remarkable tribute to his skills, at least in Trump's eyes. It's not only Israel and Ukraine, but also now Iran.
Graham, I want to talk about Iran and the way that Witkoff is talking about Iran and deal and the nuclear program of Iran. But before going to that, how did you find the Trump's visit to the Middle East? And if you were to mention the main goals of what was going on there and what was the main objective on the part of the Trump administration, and we know that Donald Trump has decided not to go to Israel, which was somehow strange because in his first administration, he went to the Middle East and Israel. And we know that JD Vance has canceled his trip to Israel because it seems that people are told there are some rumors that he's not happy with the way that Israel is just expanding the war in Gaza. What's your take on the main goals of the Trump administration in the Middle East?
That's an excellent question, Nima, and I think a lot of people are struggling with that issue. First of all, I think we have to admit that Trump is not a man who has studied deeply these issues, but he may have a fingertip feel for other personalities to have succeeded in business. I don't know that for a fact, but I suspect that he has a field. He can size people up quite quickly. Secondly, and this we should not laugh at this, I think he wants a Nobel Prize for peace. If Donald Trump can bring peace in Israel or Palestine or Iran or in Ukraine, I'm happy to give him a Nobel Prize. That's a very worth it's a very important achievement. I think he also wants to be seen as a man of peace. He's frequently mentioned this, and I don't think we can ignore that thought. It's much better than some kind of belligerent personality, threatening and shaking. Maybe he did more of that in his first term, but I think he genuinely would want to be respected as somebody seeking peace in the area and to be seen personally as the one who did it. It's very important. He wants the credit. So I think and also I think it's very interesting his treatment of Israel so far. Maybe you and I talked about this, Nima, several months ago when I said that I thought that if I were Bibi Netanyahu, I would not be comfortable with Trump. I would not trust Trump. Several times, Trump has said things or made unusual comments. He said, "Well, America will take over Gaza." I don't think Bibi liked that remark. Um, Trump has been very hostile to the idea of war with Iran. I don't think Bibi likes that. And then the idea that he announced when Bibi was in the White House that he announced that he was beginning negotiations with Iran. That was a shock, almost a slap in Bibi's face. And now maybe it's more serious. So I don't think Bibi trusts Netanyahu, and that's probably correct. But I don't think Trump trusts Bibi either because he's clearly a warmonger. It's nobody wants to be associated with him. And he has not been successful in his foreign policy. He's only been successful at murdering civilians. So I think this relationship is very complicated, but Bibi should not count on lifelong support, even though there's a great deal of Jewish money behind Trump. You may know this woman, Miriam Adelson. You've heard her name. I think she gave $100 million to Trump last time, and then this time she gave another $100 million. And now there is a joke that this hat of MAGA that everybody wears, like who likes to make America great again. People now say it's Miriam Adelson governs America. So I think that's the kind of remark that would anger Trump. It makes him look small. It makes him look like he's being manipulated by a rich Jewish woman that I think times are changing a little bit.
Graham, Israel is talking about attacking Iran, and CNN reported on that in the last 3 days. And Axios has a report that shows Israel is just preparing for an attack, not a single attack on Iran, but a prolonged attack, several days of attacks on Iran. Do you believe that Donald Trump would somehow support Israel if they do, if they decide to do that?
No, my best guess, Nima, is that Trump would not want to support him, and Trump has been quite clear that he hopes to reach a deal. That's Trump's interest in life is reaching a deal. He hopes to reach a deal with Iran and a settlement. He doesn't want war. I think even if Trump is not skilled in military affairs, I'm sure that people in the Pentagon are telling him that short of nuclear war, Iran can deliver very considerable damage to the U.S. in the Middle East, and various bases, military bases all over the Middle East, and warships and aircraft, and et cetera, et cetera. So I think Trump is probably getting advice that it would not be a good idea, and that the U.S. would not come out of it very well. Third, I don't believe CNN either. I think CNN is maybe the at the receiving end of Israeli propaganda of wanting to say, "Oh, look, this is inevitable. It's unstoppable. Bibi is going to go there. We have no choice. We have to go with Israel and back." I don't believe all of that. I think this is a big PR, very a big PR push, propaganda push on the part of Israel. But who knows? I could be wrong. I don't think so, but I could be wrong.
Here is what, Graham, here is what Steve Witkoff said in terms of the negotiations between Iran and the United States.
And at the center set of negotiations with Iran, can you give us a sense of what is the outline of the deal that President Trump wants to get with Iran?
Well, the president has been very clear. He wants to solve this conflict diplomatically and with dialogue. And he's given all the signals. He's directly sent letters to the supreme leader. I have been dispatched to deliver that message as well, and I've delivered it. But on the other hand, we have one very, very clear red line, and that is enrichment. We cannot allow even 1% of an enrichment capability. We've delivered a proposal to the Iranians that we think addresses some of this without disrespecting them. And so that's important. We want to get to a solution here, and we think that we will be able to. But everything begins from our standpoint, John, with a deal that does not include enrichment. We cannot have that because enrichment enables weaponization, and we will not allow a bomb to get here. But short.
Yeah. He calls for no enrichment in Iran, considering the sacrifices Iran has committed during many years to reach to the point that they have reached. Many assassinations, the price that they have paid for their nuclear program. And right now, Witkoff is talking about no enrichment in Iran. By the way, on the part of the Iranians, the supreme leader and the foreign minister of Iran said, with or without a deal with the United States, they're going to continue enriching uranium. They can talk about the limits on the enrichment, but you cannot say you have no permission to say we don't need any permission from you to enrich uranium. Your take on the way that Witkoff, you remember Witkoff was talking about 3.6% of enrichment. Right now, he's changing the rhetoric. What's going on in the Trump administration? Your take.
I don't know, Nima. I'm not party to those negotiations. All I can say is that these men involved, Iranians, are famous for being bargainers and in the bazaar. Witkoff is very much out of that background as well, of New York real estate bargaining, and Trump himself is. So I don't necessarily take these as absolute final positions in negotiation. I would like to also mention just one other factor that doesn't deal with the nuclear thing, because I agree with you. I think to say that no enrichment whatsoever by Iran is not a realistic position, but it may be a tough starting position. The other factor, though, I think that is very important is both the role of China and Russia. We cannot forget that China pulled an extraordinary diplomatic accomplishment several years back when they negotiated between Saudi Arabia and Iran. Everybody for years says, oh, it will never happen, and Sunnis hate Shia, and Shia hates Sunnis, and it's in their blood, it can't happen. Well, China came and showed that it wasn't in their blood, and they reached a fairly serious agreement from what I can see, and it's still holding. So that's an amazing Chinese accomplishment. And secondly, Russia has very close ties with, of course, China and Iran. The last thing that either China or Iran wants, I'm sorry, that Russia or China wants is a U.S. war with Iran. That would put Russia in an extraordinarily difficult position. As to what position do they take? Do they arm? Do they help arm Iran? Do they back America diplomatically? Or do they enter into negotiations with or without the Chinese? Both of them would be involved in theory. So I think those factors are very important, and I am confident, I have no knowledge, but I'm confident that Russia and Washington, Moscow and Washington, have been in serious discussions over this issue. It's too important to Russia, and too important a part of the world with huge implications for regional peace, potential nuclear conflict, God knows what. So in that sense, I think if we look at all the factors, um, I find it encouraging to think that there probably will not be a war in which the United States participates. And if Bibi tries it, I think it would probably be catastrophic. I'm not a military man, but military people say that Israel would suffer very seriously. They would lose the war probably, but they would suffer seriously. So I'm optimistic in that sense.
Graham, in terms of JCPOA, Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, then the agreement, the nuclear agreement between the United States and Iran during the Obama administration, we know that they have mentioned a policy of snapback sanctions. And right now, it seems that the Marco Rubio and those people who are close to Marco Rubio are pushing for those pressures on Iran. Do you do you think that the United States would be able to put pressure the way it was in the first administration in Trump 1.0, or they have to understand Russia and China are not there, as you mentioned, right, just minutes ago, and Europe is not that much powerful, that much stable to go to get along with the policy of the United States. How do you see the snapback sanctions and the leverage they're trying to make on Iran?
First of all, Nima, I'm sure you know that Washington is not united in its policies towards Iran. This has been going on for many, many years. And unfortunately, there are still a lot of neoconservative figures within the foreign policy establishment. And sadly, Trump appointed them. I have some tiny hope that maybe Trump is learning that the neocons are not good friends for what he wants to accomplish. He already fired this guy, Mike Waltz, who's a neocon. Um, I think he has overridden so many of the views of the neocons in other areas. So I think this is essentially a pressure point from the neoconservatives. I hope that they will not be successful. And for the reasons I set forth to you just a minute ago, Russian views, Chinese views, damage to American military in the Middle East, damage to Israel in the Middle East, greater tension in the region, all of those factors lead me to think that maybe snapback maybe just be a negotiating point or a discussion point, but not a serious thing. It's not what Trump wants. It would not be a victory to bring the sanctions right back again. That would be a failure on his part. He doesn't want failure, and I think he truly wants a settlement. I don't think it'll be easy. Iranians are very tough negotiators. They have strong interests in this issue. They do they do not like to be perceived as vulnerable to Western pressures, especially American pressures. But all things together, I think the weight of the argument is more on the side of a chance for the negotiations to succeed.
Graham, we've heard from the officials in the officials of Qatar, Saudi Arabia, UAE. They were talking about the way that they see the conflict in the Middle East, and they don't want a new war in the Middle East. They don't want a confrontation, direct confrontation between the United States and Iran, because they know how that would devastate the region, how that would influence drastically in a negative on a negative way. uh, and do you, when you look at Donald Trump and his trip to these three important Arab states in the Persian Gulf, do you think that was one of the main topics to be discussed during the visit? and because they're just putting a lot of money to just investing a lot in the United States. I would argue one of the main reasons would be if Donald Trump decides to not start a new war in the Middle East. That's why they're doing this. Your take on that?
Nima, I think your analysis is quite on the mark. I agree with you. We talked about Russia and China as being deeply opposed to that kind of conflict. But yes, you now raise the issue of other local forces such as Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and UAE. They have nothing to gain and everything to lose by this kind of conflict. So I suspect all of them spoke in favor of negotiations and peaceful settlement of these issues. Again, let's remember one of the major roles of one of the major elements of American foreign policy for decades and decades was to create enemies, create hostilities in the area. And it was always, Iran, the great demon, the great enemy, the threat to Iran, the threat to Islam, the threat to the region, et cetera, et cetera. That was the instrument by which the United States hoped to bludgeon and force Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and everything else to be frightened and to run into America's arms and buy American arms. I think now that that policy is no longer feasible, and it was China's ability to bring about a rapprochement between Saudi Arabia and Iran that broke the back of that capability of the United States to constantly fearmonger about about the threat of Iran. We see the same thing incidentally in Ukraine as well. Fear mongering about deep, scary Russian intentions. I think the U.S. is beginning to run out of fuel in this business of trying to scare people. It's also trying to do the same thing in East Asia, of saying, "Oh my God, the Chinese threat, and China is taking over the world, and they're more powerful than ever, and they will destroy all of you nations in Southeast Asia." Well, I'm not so sure the Southeast Asian nations are buying that argument anymore. So I'm quite happy that it looks like American fear-mongering policies are not working out in the region. And I think that's why we see a willingness on the part of Qatar, UAE, and Saudi to work for a peaceful settlement.
I believe, Graham, that what's going on in the Middle East, if it goes the way that it is right now and it's getting better, the relationship between Sunni and Shia and all of that is getting better, that would benefit the United States in a long run. Because it doesn't matter that tactically the United States is losing in the region, but in a long run, the United States, because when we talk about the United States is not the neocon, and it's much larger, bigger than that. And we have to consider the alternative coming to the power in the United States to see the reality that would benefit the United States in a long run. It's not just about the Middle East. In Ukraine, the same. In Taiwan, the same. These people should be defeated, in my opinion. Just to let the other options, the other alternatives come to power in the United States. They have been, since the collapse of the Soviet Union, they have been defeated over and over. And it doesn't seem that they get to the point that they need to change their strategy. They need to change their attitude.
Odd your views on that, Nima, but the record is not terribly encouraging. Joe Biden, who ran a terrible foreign policy and had a terrible foreign minister, Blinken, and a terrible foreign policy team, uh, very much supported, was surrounded by many neocons, including I've mercifully forgotten her name at the moment, but who was in charge of Ukrainian policies. So this is not just a Democrat or Republican issue at all. The neocons are very powerful. They're there. They are primarily Jewish, but not completely. Um, and they identify often with Israel as America's unsinkable aircraft carrier in the Middle East. All that kind of nonsense that we've been hearing for a very long time. But I wish you were right. I hope you were right, that the neocons will have proven that they have not had any success. But we will see. I think Trump may slowly begin to realize this, that the neocons are pushing and pushing and pushing for war. And maybe the old Trump was willing to be pushed, but I think this Trump is not so willing to be pushed. I think he would like to be seen as a man of peace. He said so. And I think it's quite significant that on his first trip to the Middle East, he didn't even go to Israel. So that's a message to Bibi to watch out, to not to push his neocon followers too closely. I hope you're right that their day is over. We'll see.
Graham, when it comes to Ukraine and the conflict, we had the phone call between President Trump and Vladimir Putin, President of Russia. I would assume that we know that Donald Trump was talking about the casualties, how big the number of casualties is on the part of Russians, is not that big on the part of Ukrainians, and the situation on the battlefield. Do you think that this conversation, this sort of talks would help the United States, would help specifically Donald Trump himself to just have somehow a better mind to deal with Ukraine? Because I don't see this, because the main reason that they started talking to each other, Donald Trump and the West is trying to push ceasefire, then negotiations, and Russia is talking about, no, we're going to negotiate with you while we're fighting Ukrainians on the battlefield. This is the main difference between the two parties. I don't see why the Trump administration is pushing for ceasefire. You can fight, you can decide, you can. I think that would, even with the way that Russia is offering, that would be easier to reach a deal, a Ukrainian settlement. Because if you put a ceasefire and they start arming Ukraine again and again, we know that the United Kingdom wants that. They really want to continue this war. That wouldn't help Donald Trump and his strategy.
Yes, I agree, but there are complicated issues, as you well understand. For one thing, I agree with you absolutely. I was encouraged and heartened by the negotiations and the positive discussion of reports on the 2-hour discussion between Trump and Putin. But I think Trump was also trying to partly educate the American public on this issue because, as you know, all Trump's enemies are trying to say, oh, Trump is in Putin's pocket and he's Putin's guy, blah, blah, blah. I think Trump was trying to point out that the Russians lost 25 million troops during World War II and had a vastly greater contribution to the victory over Nazi Germany than the United States, which came in very, very late in the war. So I think part of it was Trump trying to be educational. But I don't think we should focus constantly on this business of ceasefire, not ceasefire. The heart of the issue is Ukraine membership in NATO. That is the issue. If there had been no NATO issue, there would not be a war today in Ukraine. There might be other negotiations, debates, whatever else, tensions even, but it's been clear in Russian words from day one, going back 20 years, that Russia found pushing a hostile military organization like NATO up to its borders was unacceptable. The West did not listen, and we ended up with a war. But that still, Nima, is the number one issue. You can have a ceasefire, but I think Putin is saying, look, a ceasefire does not solve anything. I'm sorry, my voice is weakening a bit from my cold. Putin understands that this does not truly solve anything if it does not deal with the question of NATO membership of Ukrainian membership in NATO. Some might even argue that it's a diversion, if you will, from the main issue. Yes, if they can agree on a ceasefire for the moment, that's probably good. It may mean that there are better vibes between the two sides in discussion, then fine. But that is not the issue. And indeed, Russia has said that it is concerned that a ceasefire would only be used as a way to start rearming Ukraine for another battle, to prolong the battle further. So I think this is the issue. Of course, any ceasefire is always desirable, and maybe this could begin with a ceasefire, but that is not the main issue. And Washington cannot lose sight of the fact that it is not the primary issue at stake. If you had a ceasefire and don't solve Ukraine and NATO, you have no solution whatsoever. There will be another war. It's just like the United States. I think we've talked about this before. You know, some Americans say, well, doesn't Ukraine have a right to join NATO if it wants? Yes, in a perfect world, Ukraine does have a right to join NATO if it wants. Does Canada have the right to bring a Chinese military base to Canada to help defend maybe against American aggression in Alberta or some province in the West? The U.S. has threatened Mexico. Does Mexico have the right to bring China or Russia to make a military base on the borders of the United States to help protect itself against potential American aggression? Of course not. It would never happen. It couldn't happen. The U.S. would crush that instantly. So, yes, I think the issue is not whether Ukraine has a right. The issue is whether this is acceptable to great power politics, and it is not. It would be the same thing for India. China would never accept hostile military bases on its borders. India would never accept it. So this is the reality, I'm afraid, of international politics.
Graham, in a perfect world, as you've mentioned, why do we need NATO? Why is that?
That's a very embarrassing question in Washington, Nima. I think that is the question. I think that is, you have put your finger on the question. When, as you know, after the end of the Cold War, the Soviet bloc fell apart and the Eastern Bloc, Comecon, I think it was called, or whatever, the Eastern military bloc was taken apart.
Warsaw Pact. We had Warsaw Pact.
Thank you. Yes, Warsaw Pact. It was disassembled. And there were a few people who said, gee, maybe we should also disassemble NATO as well, because this would lead to a reduction in tensions on the east-west frontiers. But America would have nothing, did not want to hear anything about this. And NATO was America's basic primary instrument of controlling European foreign policy. I've asked Europeans, I said, what is basically European foreign policy? And they say, we don't have one. Our foreign policy is NATO, period. So I think you're right. I mean, it would make a great deal of sense to disarm both sides, but there are big military interests, war factories on both sides. The Brits love war. It would be very difficult, I think, to completely disassemble it, but it's possible. It is quite possible. And let's remember, Nima, what we are talking about here is fundamentally bringing an end to the whole business of the Cold War. This is not just about Ukraine and Russia or NATO or what. We're talking about dismantling the entire Cold War structure that existed for so many years, 50 years or something, and opening some kind of new world that Gorbachev talked about, Putin, I think, is among others, has talked about. In other words, a some kind of an agreement, a pan-European agreement that would take everybody's security considerations seriously. And that would mean no threats to Russia, no threats to Poland, no threats to Ukraine, and a demilitarization, if you will, of the of the whole of the whole region. And that will finally put an end to World War II. But right now we have not ended World War II.
You've mentioned, Graham, you've mentioned that the British love war. And we know that they love war, but they're not fighting the war. The other people are fighting their wars. And Israel, Netanyahu, I would say Netanyahu as well, he loves war, but it's not Netanyahu that is fighting these endless wars. It's the United States that is fighting this. These people have no idea what war is look like. They're just making wars to let the United States and other fight in it.
Yes, in the case of Britain, though, also Britain has never gotten over the loss of empire, global empire. I mean, the British Empire was global, and they never got over that. It was the essence of English identity and glory and power and empire and crowns and all of this kind of thing. So it's been a terrible loss for the British to see their empire vanish and melt away. Their biggest hope was that they could join up with the American empire and be the smaller junior partner in the American bigger empire. And I think that still is the case. That's why, every single British prime minister wants to have join America in war against somebody, because this reminds us that, Britain is a great country, great military power, used to be an empire. Once you've been an empire, it's like a drug. I mean, how do you get off this drug? The U.S. is on the same drug. How is it going to get off the imperial drug? It's tough. It's tough, but it's also very, very dangerous because it leads to war, endless war.
Yeah. Graham, to wrap up this session, right now we've learned that Iran is just making a new military agreement with Belarus. They have with Russia a strategic agreement. China and Russia are getting closer to each other. And with the case of India, it seems that somehow they're getting along to each other. If we assume that NATO, you mentioned NATO in a perfect form, NATO doesn't exist, but NATO, with what's going on in reality, NATO is there, is expanding and is increasing its budget, military budget. Do you think, after all, if these countries, I talk with Paul Carrick-Roberts, he says the only way to make peace in this world, that NATO is trying to manipulate everything, is to Russia, China, and Iran joining each other and making an agreement and some sort of alliance, that would make it impossible for NATO or any country to attack any of them. That would bring some sort of stability to the region and to the world. Your take on that? Your take on what Paul Carrick-Roberts is suggesting?
I think Russia will be deeply concerned and involved in the fate of Iran in the region. Russia has had bad years of history with Russia, as you yourself know very well. They've also had better years. It's arguably the most important country in the Middle East. Turkey also, but Iran is more in the center of everything. So I think at the very least, Russia makes it clear that it is concerned with the role of Iran in the region. It is the key to peace. The fact that U.S. is no longer able to promote Iran as the great threat to the Gulf states, that's another step forward. So as I mentioned earlier, I would guess, I have no knowledge whatsoever, but I would guess that there is much discussion between U.S. and Russia on this issue. And during a 2.5 hour discussion between Putin and Trump, I cannot imagine that they did not discuss this issue. And I'm sure Russia might have said, frankly, we can't sit by and watch Israel destroy Iran. We said it's unacceptable. Putin doesn't have to threaten. He can just point out that this is a deep Russian interest to preserve the peace in the area. And we know that, I mean, in Russia, it's not just Russia against Iran. I mean, Russia has a huge Muslim population, and it even has Persian-speaking Tajiks. It's a big group in Central Asia. They speak Persian. And Uzbeks who speak Turkish, a form of Turkish, and Kazakhs who speak a form of Turkish. So Russia's interest here is not just casual. Russia deeply understands that it's got 4 or 5 Middle Eastern languages right as part of the whole block of Soviet states, and it has a great understanding of this kind of thing that's more than just casual. I think Trump probably needed to be educated on that issue as well. So I think they're talking, and I hope Washington understands that if they can just stay away from neocon pressures inside the Beltway.
Good points, by the way, Graham. Thank you so much for being with us today. Great pleasure, as always.
My pleasure, Nima. I mean, we always have great discussions, and these are great critical issues. So anytime. Good.
Thank you. Take care,
Take care.
Graham. Take care.
Khuda
Bye-bye.
Hafiz. Bye-bye.
Khuda Hafiz.